But in 50 years' time, to take a figure somewhat at random, when China will probably be the world's largest economy, and certainly the fulcrum of the East Asian economy, we will be in largely uncharted waters. China's power will be hugely disproportionate compared with that of the vast majority of other states, not least and crucially in East Asia. The rise of China, because of its sheer size, is bound to redefine the nature of interstate relations in a multitude of different ways. Its power will be so great that it will require extraordinary self-discipline for it not to abuse its position. It is not surprising that in the long term there is a widespread fear of what China's transformation might mean. The potential significance of China's rise, though, is not simply about size. If it was simply about size, then why is there a widespread apprehension about the rise of China, but not India, for example? One argument is that China is simply further down the economic growth track than India. Another is that China's communist government is a cause of unease. There is substance in both of these points, but neither, I think, is the primary reason. The fact is that China is not just a humongous sized nation state. It is also a nation state of a different and very distinctive kind. Indeed, to try and understand China simply in terms of a nation state is inadequate. Its existence long predated its modern emergence as a nation state. This is one of the ways in which the world will be intellectually and politically challenged by the rise of China. Our existing conceptual apparatus, drawn essentially from the Western experience, is designed to address a rather different kind of reality to that which China, by its history, embodies. This brings me to my second general question. A nation state with a difference. China is quite different from the other 5 most populous countries in the world, namely India, the United States, Indonesia, Brazil, and Russia. Each of these is a product of the last 300 years of history, or in most cases, rather less. In contrast, China was already politically unified in 211 BC. As Jared Diamond points out in his book, Guns, Germs and Steel, quote, "It seems absurd to ask how China became Chinese. China has been Chinese almost from the beginnings of its recorded history." This statement conveys a fundamental and profound truth about China, its sheer longevity, and linked to this, what might be described as its historical and cultural distinctiveness or exceptionalism. China existed in the form of a civilization and a culture long before it ever acquired the characteristics and trappings of a modern nation state. If one wants to think of a contrasting contemporary example, then Indonesia fits the bill perfectly. A recently created, very large archipelago nation state in search both of its history and its raison d'etre. The very opposite of China, in fact. This is why talk of China breaking up, as was fashionable in the West after Tiananmen Square and the disintegration of the Soviet Union, was always somewhat absurd. China is held together by centripetal forces that have little to do with the complexion of a particular regime and everything to do with its powerful sense of history and shared culture. India, in this context, is very different. The roots of this Chinese distinctiveness, of course, lie in the rich soils of the 2 main valleys and the very early establishment of agriculture, which was able to support an extremely dense population and enable the creation, very early on, of a complex social structure. The general point I want to emphasize here is that China is not simply huge, but also very old, highly distinctive, and extremely cohesive. This has profound implications for China's future role and place in the world. Its relative coherence and homogeneity for such a large nation will serve to enhance and accentuate its influence and impact. China, in this context, will act as a new kind of global pole. For at least 200 years, the world has been dominated by the West. that is first Europe, and then since 1945, a European-derived civilization in the United States. Although there are profound differences between the two, they also share important commonalities, and significantly, they also believe that to be the case. Up to a point, there is a shared inheritance, and during the 20th century, especially after 1917, and even more after 1945, and the onset of the Cold War, that sense of affinity became manifest in the notion of the West. There are many elements to the notion of Western civilization. Ancient Greece, the Roman Empire, individualism, separation of powers, human rights, and, albeit very recently, much more recently than the West likes to think, democracy. Western hegemony has meant that Western history, ideas, values, and beliefs have dominated global discourse to an extraordinary extent over the last century, to the point where they have come to be seen as universal or near universal. The rise of China is bound to change that picture. For the first time, with the exception of Japan, a non-Western country will be one of the major powers in the world. Ideas and values, of course, are not neutral. They come from and are rooted in specific histories, cultures, and interests. The fact that China has a very different civilizational inheritance to that of the West means that China does not and will not share these values in the same way, some not at all. Instead, it is attached to other values. The Western idea of individualism, for example, is specific to the West and is not shared by China or indeed various other Confucian cultures, including Japan. On the other hand, familialism and kinship is fundamental to Chinese culture, unlike the West. And as China becomes internationally more significant, these values are likely to become more familiar and more influential outside China. Now, one might retort and say, well, Japan has been a major power for over a century, and its values have never really travelled internationally. True. But the Japanese and Chinese situations are quite different. For almost a century, Japan was the only non-Western industrial country. In such circumstances, post-Meiji Restoration, it wanted to be treated as, in effect, part of the West. It did not wish to emphasize its sense of difference, even though this was profound, except within Japan itself, that is. And therefore, it did not seek to promote a distinctive idea of Japanese modernity. Japan's approach on these matters, for the most part, was sotto voce, softly, softly. Its post-war relationship with and dependence on the United States has served to reinforce this. China's circumstances are quite different. It is far, far bigger and potentially far more powerful. Japan could be treated and accepted as an exception. A dynamic China could never be. The distinctive character of China also has another trait that I would like to consider. Like other very large countries, historically China must have been, for a very long period of time, composed of many different races and ethnicities. The other 5 populous countries I listed earlier are all of them are still melting pots of ethnic and racial diversity. China is not. Indeed, the non-Han Chinese make up, depending on which figures you use, around 10% of the population, which, given the inordinate size of China, is extraordinarily small. What is more, the Han Chinese see themselves as essentially of one, homogeneous. This is bound to have consequences for the way that China views the world. Countries, understandably, tend to see the world in terms of what they themselves are like. They naturally believe in what they are, and therefore seek to project their values onto others and treat the world accordingly. The United States is a classic case in point. The American attitude towards the world has been shaped by, and these I think are the fundamental things to understand the United States, a lack of a pre-existing feudalism, the destruction of the people who live there already, the Amerindians, the European white settler mentality, the expansionary westward movement, slavery, the new frontier spirit in other words, slavery, Christian fundamentalism, and the missionary and universalizing nature of the American Constitution.